or 2,500 years, everyone who has ever read this story has believed they know exactly where it ends. A small Greek island called Ithaca in the Ionian Sea. There's a modern island that carries the name today. Tourists visit it. There's a statue of Odysseus standing in its harbor. But a growing body of geological and linguistic research argues that this island might be the wrong one entirely, that the homeland described in the poem, in precise topographic detail, doesn't match the island that inherited its name, and that the real Ithaca may be hiding, disguised, as part of a completely different island a few miles away. That's not a minor footnote. That's the actual destination of the most famous journey home in Western literature, and scholars still can't agree on where it was. So before we get to sea monsters and witches and a trick involving a name that means nobody, we're going to do something most retellings skip. We're going to ask what's actually real underneath this story, because more of it is grounded in verifiable history than you'd expect, and the parts that aren't are stranger than the myth itself. Here's where we have to start, with a poet whose existence historians still debate. Sometime around the 8th century BCE, a name attached itself to two enormous poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Tradition calls him Homer, blind, wandering, a single genius. But the poems themselves describe events from roughly 500 years earlier, during the Late Bronze Age, a period that ended around 1200 BCE in a collapse so total that writing itself disappeared from Greece for centuries. What that means is the Odyssey wasn't written down when it happened. It was carried, generation to generation, by professional oral poets reciting from memory, reshaping the story slightly with every performance, for half a millennium before anyone finally fixed it in writing. Whether Homer was one person, a school of poets, or a name later editors attached to a tradition nobody fully owned is still called the Homeric question, and it has never been settled. Here's what makes that oral tradition remarkable rather than just old. Bards weren't reciting from memory word for word. They were composing in performance, using a strict poetic meter and a toolkit of ready-made phrases. The wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, cunning Odysseus, that fit the rhythm no matter where they landed in a line. Those repeated phrases weren't laziness. They were load-bearing scaffolding, letting a performer hold an epic tens of thousands of lines long in his head, night after night, decade after decade, without a single written copy to check against. The version that finally got written down, centuries later, was really the last iteration of a story that had already been rewritten by hundreds of anonymous performers before it. What we do know is that the war at the center of it, the Trojan War, increasingly looks like it left physical evidence behind. In the 1870s, the businessman turned archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hizarlik and found not one city, but 9, stacked on top of each other across 4,000 years of continuous habitation. Most archaeologists now accept Hizarlik as the site Homer's audience understood to be Troy, though Schliemann's own methods left the site half-ruined in the process. In his hurry to find proof of Homer's city, he dynamited straight through several layers he considered unimportant, and when he unearthed a hoard of gold jewelry and weapons he triumphantly named Priam's treasure. Later dating proved it belonged to a city that had crumbled a full 1,000 years before the Trojan War could have happened. He'd smashed through the right layer looking for it and never realized it was several floors above him the whole time. And in 2025, a fresh excavation season added something new to the record. A concentrated deposit of sling stones, clay and riverstone ammunition, dated to roughly 3,200 to 3,600 years old, sitting exactly in the window historians associate with a Bronze Age siege. It doesn't prove the Trojan War happened exactly as the Iliad describes it. Direct evidence of an organized military campaign is almost impossible to separate from evidence of a city that simply burned. But it's the closest thing to a smoking gun the site has produced in over a century of digging. So a real city, a real destruction layer. And out of its ashes, according to the poem, one particular Greek king set sail for home, carrying a reputation as the most cunning man who fought at Troy. His name is Odysseus. His homeland is Ithaca. His wife Penelope and his son Telemachus are waiting for him. The trip should take weeks. It takes 10 years. The first stop goes badly almost immediately. Landing at Ismarus to raid supplies from a Thracian tribe allied with Troy, Odysseus and his men are driven back to their ships by a counterattack. Then a storm, the first of many, blows them completely off their intended course toward an island where nothing seems dangerous at all. The Lotus Eaters offer his scouts a strange fruit. Whoever eats it stops wanting to go home. They forget their families, forget the war, forget everything, and simply want to stay. Odysseus has to physically drag his own men back to the ships before the whole crew forgets why they ever wanted to leave, tying the weeping, protesting sailors to their rowing benches so they can't swim back to shore for another bite. It's worth sitting with what that scene is actually describing. Not a monster, not a god, just a substance that erases the desire to go home. Of every danger in the poem, it's the one that requires no violence at all to be fatal to the mission, and it's often the one modern readers relate to first. The next island holds something considerably less passive. Searching for supplies, Odysseus and a small party enter a cave stocked with cheese and livestock and make themselves at home. A decision that turns out to be a mistake, because the cave belongs to a Cyclops named Polyphemus, a son of the god Poseidon, who rolls a boulder across the entrance and begins eating Odysseus's men 2 at a time. Here's the detail that makes this episode more than a monster story. When Polyphemus, half drunk on wine Odysseus offers him, asks for his guest's name, Odysseus tells him it's nobody. In the original Greek, the word is audis, and it's a pun. It sounds close enough to metis, the Greek word for cunning intelligence, the exact quality Odysseus is famous for. He isn't just lying. He's making a joke about his own nature that only the audience is meant to catch. So when Odysseus blinds the sleeping Cyclops with a sharpened stake and Polyphemus screams for help, the other Cyclops outside ask what's wrong, and he shouts back that nobody is attacking him. They shrug and walk away. Odysseus's whole survival strategy is a 3,000-year-old wordplay joke, and it works perfectly. Getting out of the cave is its own problem, though, because a blind Cyclops still checks every sheep leaving the cave by feeling its back for a rider. Odysseus solves it by having his remaining men strap themselves to the bellies of Polyphemus's own rams, riding out underneath the flock, invisible to touch. It's the kind of solution that only makes sense once you hear it. Obvious in hindsight, and exactly the sort of thing the poem keeps insisting Odysseus, and only Odysseus, would think of. But even a perfect escape isn't enough for him. Sailing away, he can't resist shouting his real name back at the cliffs, so Polyphemus can curse him properly. Poseidon hears his son's prayer, and the god of the sea decides Odysseus will lose every ship, every man, and spend a full decade getting home, if he gets home at all. What follows is less a journey than a punishment. King Aeolus, ruler of the winds, gives Odysseus a sealed leather bag containing every contrary wind that could blow him off course, keeping only the gentle western breeze free to carry his ship straight home. It works. For 9 days and nights, Odysseus doesn't sleep, refusing to let anyone else near the bag, steering his own ship personally until Ithaca's coastline is close enough to see the smoke from its hearths. Then, finally, Exhausted, he closes his eyes. And his own crew, convinced for 9 days that their captain was hoarding hidden gold from them, opens the bag to check. Every imprisoned wind bursts out at once and blows the entire fleet back across the sea they just crossed, undoing 9 days of progress in a single gust, while Odysseus wakes to watch his homeland disappear behind him for a second time. The Laestrygonians, giant cannibals, destroy 11 of his 12 ships in their harbor, spearing swimming sailors like fish and crushing hulls with boulders before the survivors can even raise anchor. The single deadliest episode in the entire poem, wiping out most of the fleet in the span of a few lines. Only the one ship Odysseus never brought into the harbor in the first place survives. On the island of Aiaia, the sorceress Circe greets the survivors with wine, cheese, and barley, laced with something that strips away memory and shape at once. One cup, and the men who trusted her hospitality are pigs, squealing and grunting inside their own crumpled human minds, fully aware of what they've become and unable to say a word about it. This is where the story hides one of its strangest real-world footnotes. Odysseus is only able to resist Circe's drug because the god Hermes gives him a protective herb called moly, black-rooted, white-flowered, described as something no mortal could safely dig up alone. For over a century, botanists and pharmacologists have tried to identify it, and the leading candidate is the common snowdrop, Galanthus nivalis. Its active compound, galantamine, is a genuine cholinesterase inhibitor, meaning it counters exactly the kind of nervous system disruption Circe's potion would cause. That same compound, galantamine, is prescribed today to treat Alzheimer's disease. Nobody can prove Homer's audience knew the specific pharmacology. But somebody, 3,000 years ago, wrote a myth about a plant that blocks confusion and memory loss, and modern medicine independently landed on a real plant that does something remarkably close to that. Once Circe releases his transformed men, Odysseus stays on her island for a year before she sends him somewhere no living hero wants to go, the Underworld, to consult the ghost of the prophet Tiresias about how to actually survive the rest of the trip. The Underworld scene is one of the strangest in the whole poem, and one of the most quietly devastating. Odysseus digs a pit, pours out blood from sacrificed animals, and watches the dead crowd toward it, desperate for a sip that lets them speak again, if only for a moment. His own mother appears among them. He'd had no idea she'd died while he was away. And when he tries 3 times to embrace her, his arms close on empty air because a ghost has no body left to hold. Then the shade of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived at Troy, tells him something that undercuts the entire heroic code the war was fought for. He would rather be a landless servant to the poorest living farmer than rule as king over every soul in the underworld. Glory, it turns out, buys nothing once you're dead. Only then does Tiresias deliver his warning, specific and easy to miss the weight of at the time. When Odysseus reaches the island of the sun, god Helios, under no circumstances should anyone touch the cattle grazing there. Remember that warning. It matters later. Leaving the land of the dead, Odysseus sails past the sirens, whose song supposedly lures sailors to their deaths on the rocks, luring them not with monstrous shrieking, but with something worse, a promise to sing them the true story of their own lives, flattering and irresistible. He has his crew plug their ears with beeswax, then has himself tied to the mast so he alone can hear the song and survive it. The first man in the story ever to do so, straining against the ropes and begging to be released as the melody grows louder, while his deafened men row on without hearing a word of it. Then comes a choice between 2 horrors in a narrow strait. Scylla, a six-headed monster lodged permanently in a cliffside, who will take exactly 6 sailors and no more, and Charybdis, a whirlpool that will take the entire ship. Odysseus chooses the smaller, guaranteed loss over the larger total one, and deliberately doesn't warn his rowers which side holds the danger, afraid they'll freeze at the oars if they know. He watches 6 of his men get seized and eaten, one scream at a time, unable to help them, and later calls it the worst thing his eyes witnessed in the entire 10 years at sea. Worse, in his own words, than anything at Troy. Then, exhausted, his surviving crew lands on Thrinacia, the island of the sun god's cattle. And this is where the warning from the Underworld gets ignored. Trapped by storms for weeks, starving, the crew waits until Odysseus falls asleep and slaughters the sacred cattle anyway. When Helios complains to Zeus, the king of the gods answers with a single lightning bolt that splits the ship in half and drowns every man aboard except Odysseus, who clings to wreckage for 9 days before washing up, alone, on the shore of the nymph Calypso. She keeps him there for 7 years, offering him immortality itself if he'll simply agree to stay and forget the wife waiting on a mortal, aging island somewhere over the horizon. It's the single most generous offer anyone makes him in the entire poem, and he refuses it, spending his nights on the beach in tears anyway, staring at a home he can't reach and wouldn't trade away his chance at even if he could stay young forever without it. Only divine intervention, the goddess Athena finally convincing Zeus to order his release, gets Odysseus off that island at all. He builds a raft. Poseidon, still furious, wrecks it. He swims, nearly drowns, and washes up naked on the shore of the Phaeacians, where a princess named Nausicaa finds him, and instead of running, brings him home to her parents' palace. It's there, listening to a court poet sing about the fall of Troy and the trick of the wooden horse, that Odysseus finally breaks down in tears in front of strangers, and finally says his own name out loud for the first time in the whole story. The Phaeacians load a ship with treasure and sail him the rest of the way home themselves. And this is where we come back to the question we opened with. Because home, in the poem, is an island called Ithaca, low-lying, Homer says, positioned furthest out to sea of its neighboring islands, with no mountains blocking its western view. And that description is a problem, because the island that has carried the name Ithaca for the last 2,500 years is mountainous, faces east, and doesn't match Homer's geography at all. In 2005, a researcher named Robert Bittlestone proposed a fix. What if Homer's Ithaca wasn't a separate island at all, but the Peliki Peninsula on the western edge of the much larger island of Kephallonia? A peninsula that, according to his theory, used to be cut off from Kephallonia by a narrow sea channel, one that repeated earthquakes and landslides gradually filled with rock and debris over the centuries, quietly welding 2 islands into one long before anyone thought to write down what had changed. Cambridge and Aberdeen researchers have since added a linguistic argument. In the entire poem, Homer never actually calls Ithaca an island. He always uses words that simply mean land or home ground, an odd omission if it obviously was one, and possibly not an omission at all if Homer knew something about its geography that later readers didn't. This debate has resurfaced again and again over the last 2 decades. New geological modeling of the fault lines running under Kephallonia, new linguistic arguments over words Homer chose almost 3,000 years ago, and still, after all of it, no agreed answer. Even researchers convinced Bittlestone was onto something can't agree on precisely where within Peliki the ancient city itself would have stood. Nobody has found the smoking gun, which means every reader who has ever pictured the ending of this story, going back generations, has been picturing a homecoming to an island that might not be the right one at all. but whichever Ithaca it was, the ending plays out the same way. Odysseus arrives home after 20 years disguised as a beggar, warned by Athena that his own palace is no longer safe. His wife Penelope, alone for 2 decades, has been besieged by suitors demanding she remarry, stalling them for years with a trick of her own, promising she would choose a husband as soon as she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, then secretly unraveling every night's work by torchlight once the suitors had gone to sleep, so the shroud stayed permanently, deliberately unfinished. It worked for 3 full years before one of her own servants betrayed the trick, and even then she simply found new ways to delay, refusing to be forced into anything faster than her own patience allowed. His son Telemachus, grown into a man Odysseus has never really known, has just returned from searching the Greek world for word of his father. When Athena finally reveals Odysseus to him, Telemachus doesn't recognize the beggar as his father at all. At first, nobody would. Still disguised, Odysseus enters his own hall to find over 100 suitors camped inside it, drinking his wine, slaughtering his livestock for feasts, and mocking the ragged old beggar in the doorway, one of them even hurling a footstool at him for sport. Penelope, unaware the beggar is her husband, has set a final test. Whoever can string her husband's old hunting bow and shoot an arrow clean through 12 axe heads lined up in a row will win her hand. Every suitor tries. Every suitor fails, unable even to bend the bow enough to string it, some straining until they're red-faced and humiliated in front of the whole hall. Then the beggar asks for a turn, and the hall erupts in laughter and insults, right up until he strings the bow in one smooth motion, as easily as a musician tuning a familiar instrument, and puts the arrow clean through all 12 axes without pausing to aim twice. What comes next isn't a fight, it's an execution. Odysseus turns the bow on the suitors who have spent 20 years eating his food, insulting his wife, and hunting his son, and with Telemachus and 2 loyal servants beside him, and the doors barred so none of them can run, he cuts them down where they stand, in the hall he built, until the floor of his own home is unrecognizable. Only then does he go to Penelope. And here's the detail that gets left out of most retellings, the one that actually proves who he is. Penelope, testing him one final time after 20 years apart, asks a servant to move their marriage bed out of their chamber, knowing that's impossible because Odysseus built it himself around a living olive tree, rooted straight into the ground, immovable by design. Only the real Odysseus would know that. When he reacts with genuine anger at the suggestion his unmovable bed could simply be carried away, Penelope finally, completely, believes it's him. 20 years of war, wandering, monsters, gods, and grief, and the thing that finally proves his identity to the one person he crossed the world to find isn't a scar, or a sword, or a name. It's a piece of furniture only he could have built, because he was the only one who knew it couldn't be moved. She asks him finally where he's been all this time. He doesn't know where to begin. 3,000 years later, neither do we. Not really. We don't know if Troy fell exactly the way the poem says, only that something burned there in roughly the right century, with sling stones in the ash to prove somebody was fighting. We don't fully know if Homer was one poet or a tradition wearing one name. We don't know whether Odysseus's Ithaca is the island with his statue standing in its harbor today, or a peninsula on Kephallonia that used to be something else before the ground itself rearranged the evidence. What we do know is that a story this old, missing this many of its own facts, still makes people weep at the ending. The same ending, told the same way, for 3,000 years. Maybe that's the actual ending underneath the ending, not knowing exactly where he landed, and needing the story anyway.